Roman Empire did not fall because its enemies were strong. It fell because its own government crushed the life out of the very people who fed it, farmed it, and bled for it, until those people simply walked away and never came back. Before we dive into one of history's most devastating economic collapses, a story of fiscal arrogance so extreme it literally emptied the landscape of the world's greatest empire. Hit that subscribe button right now. We strip away the marble and the glory every single week to show you what Rome, Greece, Persia, and every other civilization you think you know actually looked like beneath the surface. You do not want to miss what is coming, and drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? Are you in Pakistan, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Australia, India, Iran, Germany? We read every comment and we genuinely want to know. Also tell us, what should the next video be? The real economic collapse that destroyed the Ottoman Empire. How Alexander the Great's tax policy nearly broke his own conquests. The Persian tax system that made Darius the richest man who ever lived. The choice is yours. Comment your vote. Now, let us begin. Long before the legions marched, long before the Senate convened its first corrupt session, long before any man dared call himself Caesar, the Italian peninsula belonged to people who had no interest in empire at all. They were farmers, herders, village builders. The Latins, the Sabines, the Oscans, the Umbrians, tribes whose entire civilization revolved not around conquest, but around the rhythm of soil and season. They planted emmer wheat and barley along the banks of the Tiber River. When Rome was still nothing more than a collection of thatched huts perched on muddy hills, overlooking a river crossing, used primarily by cattle traders. These early Italians understood something profound that the later emperors would forget entirely. That the land was not a resource to be extracted. It was a living relationship, a covenant between people and earth that required reciprocity, patience, and respect. Their agricultural techniques, primitive by the standards of later Roman engineers, yet remarkably effective for their time and context, produced surpluses that fed growing communities and eventually attracted trade from across the Mediterranean. The Etruscans, sophisticated, artistic, politically complex, and entirely comfortable with concepts of urban planning, religious ritual, and intercity trade networks, established cities and irrigation networks in central Italy as early as 900 BCE. And it was under Etruscan cultural influence, Etruscan architectural inspiration, and quite possibly Etruscan direct political rule, that a small Latin village on the Tiber began its improbable transformation into something the ancient world had never seen before. That village, of course, was Rome. And the story of how it rose, how it weaponized taxation, and how it ultimately destroyed itself through financial greed, bureaucratic rigidity, and a fatal inability to understand the relationship between the state and the people who fed it. This is one of the most instructive and terrifying economic horror stories in all of human history. It is a story that has never fully ended, and it starts with mud. In 509 BCE, according to Roman tradition that modern historians treat with well-justified skepticism, but which encodes real cultural memory. A group of aristocratic families expelled the last Etruscan king, Tarquinius Superbus, known to history as Tarquin the Proud, and declared Rome a republic. The actual mechanics of this transformation were certainly messier and more complicated than the founding legend suggests. But the essential point holds. Rome's aristocracy wrested control of the city from monarchy and established a political system in which power was distributed among a class of leading families rather than concentrated in a single dynasty. The city that emerged from this aristocratic revolution was not the gleaming marble monument of later centuries. It was a rough, aggressive, land-hungry community of farmers and warriors who saw no contradiction between those two identities. In the Roman conception of civic virtue, the farmer and the soldier were the same man at different seasons. You plowed your fields in spring, harvested in autumn, and marched to war in summer. This was not mere coincidence of scheduling. It was a deliberately cultivated identity, a foundational myth of Roman character that the Republic propagated with extraordinary consistency across 5 centuries of political and social change. The Roman Republic's foundational genius lay in how it organized its agricultural society. Roman citizenship came bundled with land rights, military obligations, and a stake in the Republic's survival. The farmer who plowed his fields in spring was the same man who strapped on a bronze breastplate in summer to defend those same fields. This was not mere coincidence. It was deliberate policy, a brilliantly integrated system where military service and agricultural production reinforced each other in a self-sustaining loop of civic virtue. The early Romans called this ideal the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. And at its heart was a vision of the sturdy, independent smallholder who owed everything to Rome, and from whom Rome owed everything in return. A man named Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus recalled from his plow in 458 BCE to serve as dictator during a military crisis when the Equi threatened to destroy a Roman army, became the living symbol of this ideal, a farmer warrior so devoted to the Republic that he returned to his fields the moment the emergency passed, surrendering the absolute power of the dictatorship after just 15 days, because he believed, genuinely and without affectation, that his farm mattered more than his political position. Rome celebrated this story for centuries, and then spent those same centuries systematically destroying everything Cincinnatus represented. The Ager Publicus, the public land, was central to this early republican agricultural system. As Rome expanded through conquest of neighboring Latin and Italian tribes, conquered land was not simply distributed as private property. Much of it was declared public land, to be leased at modest rates to Roman citizens for agricultural use, with the legal provision that no single family could hold more than 500 iugera, roughly 125 modern hectares. This limit, enshrined in the Licinian section laws of 367 BCE, represented the Republic's attempt to prevent land concentration and maintain the class of small, independent farmers that its military system depended upon. It was a law that would be almost universally violated by the aristocracy almost immediately upon its enactment, and the gap between the law's intent and the reality of land distribution would eventually detonate Roman politics in the 2nd century BCE. The single greatest achievement of this early Republican era was not military, but structural. Rome created the census, the systematic enumeration and categorization of every citizen, every piece of land, every ox, every slave, every amphora of olive oil that the Republic contained. The censors, 2 senior magistrates, elected every 5 years to conduct this enumeration, compiled their registers with a thoroughness that no previous Mediterranean civilization had attempted at comparable scale. The census served multiple functions simultaneously. It determined military service obligations based on property qualification. It allocated voting rights within the tribal and centuriate assemblies, and it formed the basis for the tributum, the direct property tax levied during wartime emergencies to fund military operations when the normal state revenue was insufficient. This was Rome's first formal engagement with systematic taxation, and in its early form, it was actually rather equitable by ancient standards. The tributum fell proportionally on property. The more land and capital you possessed, the more you paid. Crucially, in years when the state had sufficient revenue from other sources, conquest and plunder, tribute from defeated peoples, harbor and market fees, the leasing of public lands, the tributum was often suspended entirely, or even refunded to citizens. The Roman state, in this early period, genuinely conceived of taxation not as an extraction mechanism designed to enrich the state at the expense of its citizens, but as a collective contribution to shared defense, more akin to a levy than a permanent obligation. Citizens paid when Rome needed them to pay. The state acknowledged this as a burden rather than as an inherent right of government, and the expectation of eventual reimbursement in good years maintained a sense of fiscal partnership rather than fiscal predation. This reciprocal understanding between Roman citizens and their government, fragile and imperfect and dependent on a military success that generated enough plunder to keep the arrangement viable, represented a social contract that would take nearly 5 centuries to fully unravel. But unravel it would, spectacularly, catastrophically, and with consequences that reshaped European civilization for the next 2,000 years. Yet the very success of the Roman military machine contained the seeds of the agrarian system's destruction, because every war Rome won brought home slaves, hundreds of thousands of captured human beings who could work land without wages, without citizenship rights, without political representation, and without the power to complain about their conditions, making the independent Roman smallholder economically obsolete almost overnight in territory after territory, wherever slave agriculture spread. With the conquest of cheap slave labor flooding Italian agriculture, the stage was cleared for a transformation of Roman landholding so radical it would reshape the entire Mediterranean economy and set in motion the chain of crises that would eventually require Diocletian's desperate fiscal surgery 1,700 years later. In 264 BCE, Rome crossed the Strait of Messina for the first time and stepped onto Sicilian soil, beginning the First Punic War against Carthage, and initiating a century of conquest so vast, so relentless, and so transformative that the republic that emerged from it would barely resemble the one that entered it. Between 264 and 133 BCE, Rome defeated Carthage twice in wars of extraordinary ferocity and duration, subdued Macedonia and Greece, dismembered the Seleucid Empire's western territories in Asia Minor, and effectively became the unchallenged master of the entire Mediterranean basin, the sea that Romans would eventually call Mare Nostrum, our sea, with the casual territorial confidence of people who have forgotten that any other option existed. The general Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, who defeated the Carthaginian genius Hannibal Barca at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, became the avatar of this age, brilliant, aristocratic, supremely confident, and entirely representative of the new Roman elite that was accumulating wealth, slaves, land, and influence at a pace the early republic's founders could never have imagined, and almost certainly would have recognized as profoundly dangerous. Each conquest brought an influx of captives pressed into agricultural servitude. After the Third Macedonian War concluded at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, 150,000 Epirotes were sold into slavery. After the destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, the city razed to the ground, its population killed or enslaved, the ground allegedly salted to prevent regeneration, though modern historians dispute the salting. After the sack of Corinth, that same catastrophic year, after the pacification of Spain following decades of brutal guerrilla warfare, after the annexation of the kingdom of Pergamon in 133 BCE, slaves poured into Italy by the hundreds of thousands. Conservative estimates suggest that by 100 BCE, slaves constituted between 30 and 40% of the total population of Italy. a demographic revolution without precedent in the ancient world. One that fundamentally restructured the economics of agricultural production in ways that made the traditional smallholder farm simply uncompetitive. The mechanism of agricultural transformation was straightforward but devastating. A Roman aristocrat with access to cheap slave labor could produce grain, wine, and olive oil at costs that a free farmer, who had to feed his own family and pay market rates for any additional labor, simply could not match. The slave-worked latifundium, the great estate, dominated the most productive agricultural land of central and southern Italy. The rich volcanic soils of Campania, the wide plains of Apulia, the valleys of Etruria. The free smallholder, unable to compete, had two options: sell his farm at distressed prices to his wealthy neighbor, or simply abandon it and move to the city. Hundreds of thousands chose both options across the 2nd century BCE, creating in Rome and other Italian cities an explosive, impoverished, politically volatile urban proletariat that had lost everything and had nothing to lose. The greatest economic achievement of this conquest era was the creation of Mediterranean-wide commercial agriculture. The Roman villa system, at its productive peak, the wealthy Roman aristocrat of the 2nd century BCE operated not like a feudal lord of the medieval type, but like a surprisingly modern agribusiness entrepreneur. Men like Marcus Porcius, Cato the Elder, the famously austere senator who wrote the first Latin agricultural treatise, De Agricultura, around 160 BCE, managed their estates with a cold-eyed focus on maximum returns. Cato recommended precise slave-to-land ratios for olive groves and vineyards, calculated optimal returns on different crop investments, advised on the rotation of crops to maintain soil fertility, and offered cold, practical guidance on selling off elderly or sick slaves before their maintenance costs exceeded their productive value. This was agricultural capitalism in ancient form, ruthlessly efficient and entirely comfortable with the human cost of that efficiency. The philosophy was explicit. An estate existed to generate profit, and every element of its operation, the soil, the trees, the animals, and yes, the human beings working them, was a capital asset to be optimized. This was not a secret or shameful view. Cato published it. Wealthy Romans read it as practical guidance, not moral indictment. The latifundia system worked spectacularly well in economic terms. Roman Italy in 150 BCE produced wine, olive oil, and grain of sufficient quality and quantity to supply not just the peninsula, but an entire empire of dependent territories. The prosperity this generated funded Rome's first cultural explosion, the early flowering of Latin literature. The brilliant comedies of Plautus and Terence, which adapted Greek theatrical traditions to Roman urban sensibilities with remarkable creative energy. The stern philosophical works of the elder Cato himself, the elegiac poetry that was already beginning to explore the tensions between Rome's aggressive external confidence and its internal social anxieties. The Roman Forum in this period was being transformed from a muddy marketplace into a genuine civic monument, with temples, basilicas, and rostra that reflected the Republic's growing self-confidence as the dominant Mediterranean power. But this prosperity rested entirely on the back of enslaved human beings and on the economic obliteration of the independent farmers who had once been Rome's moral and military backbone. A foundation as beautiful and as unstable as a palace built on sand, but the independent Roman smallholder who had served in every legion that won every one of those conquests, who had spent years away from his farm fighting in Spain or Macedonia or Africa, returned from his campaigns to find his land absorbed into a neighbor's latifundium, his family displaced, and his only option the teeming, desperate, politically explosive urban slums of Rome itself, creating a landless proletariat so massive and so angry that it would detonate Roman politics like a bomb. It was at this moment of explosive social tension that a young tribune named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus stepped onto the rostra in 133 BCE and proposed something that the Roman aristocracy found more terrifying than any foreign army: the redistribution of land. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, was not a radical revolutionary by temperament or ideology. He was an aristocrat himself, a member of one of Rome's most distinguished families, connected by birth and marriage to the highest circles of Roman society. He saw the problem with crystalline clarity, not because he was an outsider, but precisely because he was an insider who understood both the scale of the agrarian crisis and the political system's capacity to address it. His diagnosis was correct. Rome had conquered the world, and in doing so had destroyed the class of men who made conquest possible in the first place. The legions of Scipio Africanus had been made up of citizen farmers with land qualifications. The landless proletariat that had replaced them was technically exempt from military service and represented both a military vulnerability and a social time bomb. His solution was elegant, ancient, and constitutionally defensible: enforce the existing legal limit of 500 iugera on individual holdings of public land, and distribute the recovered surplus in small plots to landless citizens, recreating the independent farmer class that Rome needed. The Senate, stuffed with the very aristocrats who stood to lose millions in illegally held land value, responded not with reasoned opposition, but with murderous fury when Tiberius sought an unprecedented second term as tribune to protect his legislation. A mob of senators and their clients beat him to death with their bare hands, and the legs of overturned furniture in the Capitoline temple precinct. The first political murder within Rome's sacred boundary in centuries, a violation so flagrant that even Tiberius's opponents understood it had broken something fundamental about the Republic. His body was thrown into the Tiber. His brother Gaius Gracchus attempted the same and more ambitious reforms a decade later, and died in 121 BCE, killed by his enemies or by his own hand in the grove of Farina on the Janiculum Hill. Depending on which source you read, their deaths did not resolve the agrarian crisis. They merely radicalized it, demonstrating conclusively that the Roman Republic's political system could no longer manage the social contradictions that conquest had created through any mechanism short of violence. The century that followed the age of Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, Caesar, Mark Antony, and Octavian was essentially one long, bloody argument about who controlled Rome's land, Rome's armies, and Rome's tax revenue, conducted with swords rather than ballots. Gaius Marius, the new man from Arpinum, who reformed the Roman army between 107 and 100 BCE, transformed the military relationship with land by recruiting the landless proletariat into the legions and promising veterans land grants upon discharge. This was a solution to the manpower crisis, but it created a new and more dangerous problem. Soldiers now looked to their general for their land, not to the state. The general, who could promise the best land settlement, commanded the most loyalty. The general with the most loyal army controlled the Republic. This was the logic that led, inexorably, from Marius through Sulla's marches on Rome in 88 and 83 BCE, to Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE, and eventually to the one-man rule that Augustus institutionalized after 27 BCE. The cultural and intellectual achievement of this tortured late Republican era was paradoxically and almost perversely magnificent. Even as the Republic tore itself apart in escalating cycles of civil war, Roman literature reached its first great flowering, as if the proximity of catastrophe sharpened every intellectual blade. Marcus Tullius Cicero composed his Philippics against Mark Antony, his philosophical treatises attempting to introduce Greek philosophical tradition into Latin thought, and his forensic masterpieces that remain unsurpassed models of rhetorical advocacy. Gaius Julius Caesar, military genius, political revolutionary, writer of startling prose clarity, and by any definition, one of the most consequential human beings who ever lived, composed his Gallic Wars and Civil War with a third-person detachment that simultaneously concealed and revealed his extraordinary self-regard. Titus Lucretius Carus wrote De Rerum Natura, a 6-book philosophical poem of breathtaking intellectual ambition that expounded Epicurean atomic materialism in Latin hexameters of haunting beauty. Gaius Valerius Catullus penned love poetry so raw and immediate that readers feel the same electric anguish 2,100 years later. Most significantly for our story, Julius Caesar, as dictator between 49 and 44 BCE, attempted genuine fiscal and social reform on a scale that no previous Roman politician had attempted since the Gracchi. He implemented debt relief measures. He distributed land to veterans and to the urban poor in new colonies established across Italy, Gaul, Spain, Greece, and North Africa, resettling perhaps 80,000 families. He reformed the calendar, giving us essentially the calendar we still use today. He attempted to rationalize the tax collection system in the provinces by replacing the corrupt publicani, private tax farmers who paid the state for the right to collect taxes, and then extracted as much as possible from provincial populations with direct state collection in certain territories. These were the last serious attempts by a Roman leader to address the fundamental agrarian problem constructively rather than through extraction. And they were interrupted by 23 stab wounds on the 15th of March, 44 BCE. Yet Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, by senators who feared monarchy more than they feared social collapse, destroyed not just a man, but the last coherent reform program Rome would know for 2 generations, leaving his adopted heir Octavian to build a new order not on social justice, but on military dominance and the brilliantly concealed reality of one-man rule. Then, from the bloodied fields of Philippi in 42 BCE and Actium in 31 BCE, from the final civil wars that exhausted every alternative, a new political order emerged, one that would project Roman power to its greatest geographic extent, while quietly allowing the agrarian foundations of that power to continue rotting from within. Gaius Octavius Thurinus, Augustus, as he would be known after the Senate bestowed that honorific title in 27 BCE, was the most politically gifted man the ancient world ever produced, and his gifts were specifically the gifts of a man who understood the difference between power and its appearance, between what Rome needed and what Rome could be made to believe it was getting. He understood something that every ruler since has learned the hard way. People do not revolt against power when they believe that power is being used on their behalf, or at least when the machinery of that power is sufficiently concealed beneath the comfortable furniture of familiar tradition. His genius lay in making an absolute monarchy look like a restored republic. He took the title princeps, first citizen, rather than king or dictator. He maintained the Senate, the consulship, the traditional magistracies, all the theatrical machinery of republican government, while concentrating actual decision-making power entirely in his own hands through a combination of informal influence, personal prestige, military command authority, and the simple fact that everyone who might have challenged him was dead. He had watched his adoptive father Caesar murdered for being too openly monarchical, for allowing divine honors, for sitting when the Senate entered, for generally behaving with an aristocratic contempt for republican sentiment that even Caesar's supporters found difficult to defend. Augustus did not intend to make the same mistake. He was ostentatiously modest in his personal lifestyle, living in a house on the Palatine that was comfortable but not outrageously lavish by aristocratic standards. He wore homespun wool. He ate simple food. He walked to appointments rather than being carried in a litter. He was, in the original political sense of the word, the first great populist demagogue of the Western tradition. And he was also, beneath this carefully maintained exterior, the most powerful autocrat Rome had ever produced. On the agricultural front, Augustus launched the most impressive land distribution program in Roman history. He settled approximately 300,000 veterans on farms across Italy and the provinces between 31 and 14 BCE, founding something like 28 new colonies in Italy alone and many more abroad. He paid for these land grants, crucially, from his own enormous personal fortune, rather than confiscating land from current owners. Having learned from Caesar's experience that forced confiscations created generations of implacable enemies, this was not altruism. It was strategic genius of the highest order. Veterans with land were stable taxpayers and conservative voters who owed their prosperity directly to Augustus. They were the foundation of the Augustan political order. Men who had reason to support the status quo because the status quo had given them something to lose. The cultural achievement of the Augustan age stands as perhaps the single greatest literary explosion in Western history, a concentration of genius so dense and so durable that it has shaped European literature continuously for 2,000 years. Publius Virgilius Maro, Virgil, wrote under Augustan patronage and produced 3 works of transformative importance. The Eclogues, pastoral poems that explored the displacement of Italian farmers during the Civil War land confiscations, with a gentle melancholy that barely concealed its political edge. The Georgics, 4 books of didactic poetry about farming that argued, with extraordinary artistry, that the health of Roman civilization was inseparable from the health of Italian agriculture. And the Aeneid, Rome's founding epic, a poem of such consummate artistry that it became the foundational text of European literature for 15 centuries. The Georgics deserve particular attention in this story because they represent the clearest literary statement of what Roman agrarianism was supposed to be. Virgil wrote with genuine passion about the Italian countryside, about the labor of cultivation, about the dignity of the farmer who works his own land and sleeps under his own roof. He described plowing, harvesting, beekeeping, and the care of livestock with the loving attention of someone who understood that these activities were not merely economic, but spiritual, not merely practical, but civilizational. The Georgics were, in this reading, a lament as much as a celebration. a vision of what Rome had been and was trying to restore, written at the very moment when the forces that had destroyed that world were being rebuilt in new and more durable forms. Horace, Ovid, Livy the historian, Vitruvius the architect, and Maecenas, the greatest arts patron in Roman history, all flourished in this golden moment. The Forum of Augustus, completed in 2 BCE, featured a statue of the emperor in his triumphal chariot, flanked by porticos displaying the great heroes of Roman history. A staggering assertion of dynastic legitimacy in stone and marble that spoke directly to the Roman obsession with ancestral virtue. Rome at this moment felt eternal, inevitable, invincible, the city at the center of the world, the inheritor of all previous civilizations, the fulfillment of human political potential. But the prosperity of the Augustan Golden Age concealed 3 structural problems that no amount of literary genius or architectural grandeur could resolve. Slave labor continued to undercut free farmers' economic viability, despite the best rhetorical efforts of the Georgics. The army's expansion created permanent fiscal pressures that would only intensify as the frontiers hardened and expansion became impossible. And the Augustan settlement, dependent entirely on the personal genius and personal authority of one man, had no mechanism for replicating that genius in his successors. But Augustus, who lived with extraordinary tenacity to the age of 75 and governed Rome with undiminished capability, almost to his final months, could not live forever. And when he died on August 19, 14 CE, on the road to Naples, he bequeathed to his stepson Tiberius not just an empire, but a time bomb, an imperial fiscal system that required constant expansion to fund itself, constant military success to maintain the loyalty of the armies that supported it, and constant social stability to maintain the agricultural productivity that paid for everything. With the fall of Augustus's guiding hand, the stage was cleared for 2 centuries of increasingly erratic imperial management that would gradually transform Rome's tax system from a relatively sustainable extraction mechanism into something approaching organized state terror against the empire's own productive population. Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus was competent, gloomy, deeply suspicious of nearly everyone, and entirely lacking his stepfather's theatrical political genius. He governed Rome for 23 years, between 14 and 37 CE, with a dour efficiency that kept the state solvent. He famously remarked that a good shepherd shears his sheep, but does not flay them, an agricultural metaphor that reveals both his fiscal instinct and its limits, but inspired neither loyalty nor popular affection. His successor Caligula burned through the enormous treasury surplus that Tiberius's parsimony had accumulated within approximately a year, possibly less, through theatrical displays of extravagance, massive building projects, and a governing style that ranged from eccentrically erratic to genuinely terrifying. The Praetorian Guard murdered him in January 41 CE, inaugurating the pattern that would define Roman politics for the next 2.5 centuries. The army making and unmaking emperors in accordance with its institutional interests and the financial promises of competing claimants. Claudius Nero, the year of the 4 emperors in 69 CE, the Flavians, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, each contributed something to Rome's fiscal evolution. Vespasian in particular, who dragged Rome back from the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors with the pragmatic force of a man who had grown up poor and retained throughout his life the healthy disrespect for aristocratic pretension that distinguished origin typically instills, was the emperor who reportedly held a coin under his son Titus's nose when Titus objected to a tax on public urinals and asked whether it smelled. Pecunia non olet, money has no smell. This attitude that revenue was revenue regardless of its source, its human cost, or the indignity of its extraction, was not unique to Vespasian, but he articulated it with a bluntness that most emperors preferred to dress in more elevated language. What is particularly notable about Vespasian's reign is his systematic exploitation of the Jewish war's aftermath after Titus's destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple in 70 CE. Vespasian redirected the 2 drachma temple tax that Jews across the empire had voluntarily contributed to their temples' upkeep into the fiscus Judaicus, a compulsory tax on all Jews in the empire, payable to the Roman treasury. This was taxation as humiliation, deliberately designed to remind a defeated people of their subjugation every time they paid. But it established a template that subsequent emperors would use in other contexts, identifying specific ethnic, religious, or social groups as special targets for fiscal extraction, an approach that would become increasingly systematic as the empire's general revenue declined. The greatest architectural achievement of the Flavian era was the Colosseum, the Flavian amphitheater, completed under Titus in 80 CE after roughly a decade of construction on the former site of Nero's private lake, a location chosen with pointed populist symbolism to demonstrate that the new dynasty returned to the Roman people what the previous one had stolen for private use. The Colosseum could seat between 50 and 80,000 spectators for gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, public executions, and occasionally mock naval battles when the arena floor was flooded. It was built using the spoils of the Jewish War of 70 CE, the golden menorah, the sacred vessels of the temple, the immense wealth of the Jerusalem treasury, and the forced labor of approximately 100,000 Jewish captives enslaved after Jerusalem's destruction. The Colosseum is simultaneously Rome's most iconic architectural achievement and a perfect emblem of its fiscal and social logic. Fund public infrastructure with the proceeds of military conquest and the labor of enslaved war captives. Then use the resulting entertainment venue to distract the urban proletariat from its economic misery with bread and circuses. This model worked magnificently as long as the conquests kept coming. But by the end of the Flavian dynasty, Rome had reached what modern historians call its natural frontiers: the Rhine and Danube in Europe, the Euphrates and Syrian desert in the east, the Sahara in the south, the Atlantic in the west. With territorial expansion generating diminishing returns, the Roman fiscal system faced a structural choice. It would defer for another century, reform itself fundamentally, or increase the pressure on the existing tax base until the base broke. Yet, the most consequential Flavian legacy was not architectural, but constitutional. The precedent, made irrefutably clear in 96 CE, when the Senate arranged the assassination of the tyrannical Domitian and selected its own candidate, Nerva, as successor. That imperial legitimacy ultimately derived from military approval, and that no emperor could afford to prioritize long-term fiscal reform over the immediate financial demands of the armies, without which his survival was measured in months rather than years. This instability continued until the Antonine dynasty temporarily masked the problem with 2 generations of exceptional governance. But masked problems do not disappear. They grow larger and more dangerous in the darkness. The Nerva-Antonine dynasty, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, governed Rome for nearly a century between 96 and 180 CE. And this period is what Edward Gibbon, writing in his magnificent Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 1770s, called the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. Gibbon was wrong in the details. The slaves, the provincial populations ground by taxation, the frontier soldiers dying of cold on the Rhine might have described their happiness and prosperity somewhat differently. But he was right about the comparison. Among the alternatives that actual Roman history offered, the Antonine century was the best one available. Marcus Ulpius Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, embodied this age at its most confidently expansive. Born in the Spanish province of Baetica, the first Roman emperor born outside Italy, Trajan combined genuine military genius with practical governance and a fiscal intelligence that his predecessors had largely lacked. His 2 Dacian wars, fought between 101 and 106 CE, across the Danube into the territory of modern Romania, conquered a kingdom spectacularly rich in gold and silver mines. Ancient sources record that Dacian treasure delivered to Rome amounted to 165 tons of gold and 330 tons of silver, plus 500,000 captive slaves and immense quantities of livestock and agricultural equipment. A windfall so enormous that Trajan used it to fund the elimination of the vectigal, an inheritance and commercial tax for a period, and to fund the construction of the most architecturally ambitious complex Rome ever built, the Forum of Trajan, including Trajan's Market, Trajan's Basilica, and Trajan's Column. A spiral narrative sculpture 30 meters high depicting the entire Dacian campaign in cinematic detail that art historians still study with reverence. The Antonine Age produced Rome's most sophisticated philosophical and literary culture. Marcus Aurelius, emperor from 161 to 180 CE, governing an empire of roughly 60 million people from the Sahara to Scotland, and from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, wrote the Meditations, a private philosophical diary composed in Greek, in the Stoic tradition. Amid the pressures of military campaigns on the Danube frontier against the Marcomanni and Quadi, these notes to himself, never intended for publication, and perhaps not intended to be preserved at all, constitute one of the most intimate and moving documents of inner life to survive from antiquity. A powerful man wrestling honestly with his own limitations, with the nature of duty, with the relationship between what we can control and what we cannot, with the approach of death. They are also read carefully, deeply anxious documents, the reflections of a man who understood that the world he governed was more fragile than it appeared, and that the role he occupied required of him more than he was certain he possessed. Architecturally, Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 CE, produced the Pantheon in Rome, rebuilt entirely between 118 and 125 CE, with a coffered concrete dome 43.3 meters in diameter that remained the largest in the world, until Florence's Brunelleschi surpassed it in the early 15th century. The same Hadrian built his famous defensive wall across northern Britain in 122 CE, stretching 118 kilometers from coast to coast, and the Villa Adriana at Tivoli, a private imperial retreat covering an area larger than the entire city of Pompeii, incorporating architectural quotations from every corner of the empire in a dizzying display of cosmopolitan sophistication. Economically, the Antonine period maintained the empire's agricultural productivity through consistent governance, systematic road maintenance that facilitated market integration, relative military success on the frontiers, and the relative absence of the civil wars that devastated farmland and disrupted market networks. Tax collection under the Antonines was firm but regulated. There existed a functional relationship between the imperial state and the farming population, a grudging acceptance on both sides of the terms of their relationship. But the systemic problems had not been solved. Slave agriculture still undercut free farmers in the most productive regions. The army's cost was rising. The currency was beginning its long debasement, and the Antonine plagues, beginning in 165 CE, when Lucius Verus's soldiers returned from the Parthian War, carrying an unknown disease, almost certainly smallpox, that killed perhaps 5 million people across the empire, began the demographic damage that would accelerate catastrophically in the next century. However, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the model of Stoic governance, the man who had read enough philosophy to know exactly how badly human institutions tend to corrupt themselves when unchecked, made the single most consequential dynastic mistake in imperial history when he broke the Antonine tradition of adopting the most capable available man as successor, and instead elevated his biological son, Lucius Aurelius Commodus, to rule an empire that would crush its own people for the next century and more. Then, from the northern frontiers, where Marcus Aurelius had spent his final years campaigning in temperatures cold enough to freeze the Danube solid, a new and terrible era began, not with a dramatic military defeat, but with the appointment of a vain, erratic, and dangerous young man to govern the most complex state the Western world had produced. The years between Commodus's reign, 180 to 192 CE, and the establishment of the Severan dynasty represent a hinge point in Roman history that is easy to miss because it lacks the dramatic narrative simplicity of either the golden age that preceded it or the catastrophe that followed. Commodus was not the worst emperor Rome produced. That competition has strong candidates in Caligula, Domitian, and Elagabalus. But he was perhaps the most comprehensively inappropriate, a physically imposing, narcissistically self-obsessed ruler who identified himself publicly with Hercules, appeared in gladiatorial combat in the Colosseum, and showed precisely no interest in the complex administrative and fiscal challenges that governing a 60 million person empire in the age of plague and frontier pressure actually required. He was strangled by a wrestler named Narcissus in 192 CE on New Year's Eve, and Rome briefly exhaled Lucius Septimius Severus, who seized power in 193 CE after the year of the 5 emperors, one of the most chaotic 12-month periods in Roman history, dispatching his rivals at the Battle of Lugdunum in 197 CE, was a military man from Leptis Magna in North Africa, the first emperor of African origin and a ruler of ferocious practical intelligence, who brought to the throne exactly the unsentimental fiscal realism that his situation required. He reportedly told his sons Caracalla and Geta on his deathbed in 211 CE, "Enrich the soldiers, scorn all other men." This was not merely brutal cynicism. It was an accurate diagnosis of political reality in the post-Antonine Empire. The army was the only institution that truly mattered for political survival. Severus raised legionary pay by approximately 50%, allowed soldiers to legally marry and live with their families rather than in barracks, granted military officers advancement opportunities that previous emperors had reserved for the traditional senatorial aristocracy and founded 3 new legions, increasing the total military establishment to 33 legions, plus auxiliary and naval forces. He paid for all of this by increasing taxes across the board, by debasing the silver content of the denarius from roughly 60% silver to about 50%, the long debasement that would eventually reduce the coin to a bronze token washed in silver, and by confiscating the property of his political enemies with a thoroughness that made previous emperors look almost restrained. The Severan dynasty's most significant cultural and legal achievement came from a single document issued in 212 CE, the Constitutio Antoniniana, promulgated by Caracalla, who ruled from 211 to 217 CE as one of Rome's most personally repellent emperors, murdering his own brother Geta in their mother Julia Domna's arms to secure sole rule, massacring thousands of Alexandrians in 215 CE after they mocked him in public performances, and combining physical courage with intellectual emptiness in a combination that proved catastrophically dangerous. The Constitutio Antoniniana extended Roman citizenship to virtually every free inhabitant of the empire, with a few minor exceptions. In a single stroke, the legal distinction between Roman and provincial that had structured Mediterranean society for centuries was effectively abolished. Modern historians debate Caracalla's motivation endlessly. Was this genuine magnanimity, a recognition that the empire's strength lay in its diversity? Or was it the fiscally motivated land grab of a cash-strapped government? The evidence strongly favors the latter interpretation, because Roman citizenship carried specific tax obligations. The inheritance tax, the vicesima hereditarium, a 5% levy on inheritances, applied only to Roman citizens. By extending citizenship to tens of millions of provincials who had previously been exempt from this tax, Caracalla dramatically and immediately expanded the inheritance tax base across the empire. This was, in effect, the first truly empire-wide comprehensive fiscal reform since Augustus, and it demonstrated conclusively that the imperial government had shifted its primary fiscal strategy from growing the economic pie to extracting more slices from the existing one, a shift with profound and ultimately fatal consequences. Yet the Severan dynasty's most lasting legacy was not its legal revolution or its architectural achievements at Leptis Magna and in Rome itself, but the terrible precedent it established and reinforced, that emperors governed at the pleasure of the army, that soldiers must be paid above all other fiscal obligations, that farmers, merchants, artisans, and urban dwellers existed primarily as revenue sources for military expenditure. A logic that the following 50 years of crisis would pursue to its most catastrophically destructive conclusion with the assassination of Severus Alexander in 235 CE by soldiers, who found him insufficiently aggressive in his negotiations with Germanic tribes, and demanded a more warlike emperor. Rome stumbled into the abyss of the crisis of the 3rd century. 50 years of civil war, plague, economic collapse, and agricultural devastation, so severe that many regions of the empire never fully recovered. Between 235 and 284 CE, the Roman Empire experienced what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. And the word crisis dramatically understates what actually happened. In those 50 years, at least 50 individuals claimed the imperial title at various points. Most ruled for less than 2 years before being murdered by their own troops, killed in battle against a rival claimant, or simply overwhelmed by events beyond any individual's control. The empire's military, administrative, and fiscal systems, already under significant stress from the Antonine plagues and the Severan fiscal deterioration, collapsed in a cascade of mutually reinforcing failures. Civil war devastated agricultural regions across the empire. When armies passed through a district, they ate what was there, burned what they could not carry, killed or enslaved the farmers who could not flee, and left behind landscapes that required years to recover productivity. The Antonine Plague, which had begun under Marcus Aurelius, continued to claim victims through the mid-3rd century. The plague of Cyprian struck between roughly 249 and 262 CE. Its pathogen unidentified with certainty, possibly measles, possibly a hemorrhagic fever of some kind, and may have killed 5,000 people per day in Rome at its peak, spreading through every province with democratic impartiality. External enemies, simultaneously sensing weakness and responding to the destabilization of Rome's frontier defenses, launched unprecedented deep penetrating raids. The Alemanni and Franks in the west destroyed cities in Gaul, crossed into Italy, and reached the Po Valley. The reconstituted Persian Empire of the Sasanian dynasty, aggressive, well-organized, and culturally sophisticated in ways that Roman sources consistently underestimated, launched major offensives in the east. In 260 CE, the Sasanian king Shapur I captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle at Edessa. Not negotiated his surrender, not defeated him and allowed him to escape, but physically captured the ruler of Rome and paraded him as a trophy through Persian cities. Shapur commemorated this achievement in spectacular rock relief carvings at Naqshi Rostam in modern Iran, showing Valerian kneeling or standing before the triumphant Persian king in postures of complete subjugation. The empire actually fractured. The Gallic Empire, modern France, Spain, and Britain, split off under its own emperors from 260 to 274 CE. The Pomeranian Empire under Queen Zenobia controlled Syria, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor for a decade. In the most literal sense, the Roman Empire ceased to exist as a coherent political entity, though none of the fragments recognized this as permanent. Even in this era of apparently total catastrophe, certain individuals of extraordinary ability managed to impose temporary order. Lucius Domitius Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275 CE, accomplished the extraordinary feat of reuniting the fragmented empire by force in just 5 years. He defeated the Gallic Empire, crushed Zenobia's Pomeranian kingdom, and brought that remarkable queen to Rome in golden chains, stabilized the Danube frontier, and rebuilt the empire's administrative coherence with a speed and determination that earned him the title Restorer of the World, Restitutor Orbis. From a senate that understood it was witnessing something genuinely remarkable. His most enduring physical legacy was Aurelian's wall around Rome itself, completed around 275 CE. A massive defensive circuit, nearly 19 kilometers long with 383 towers, built because Rome required defensive walls for the first time in centuries, because the Italian countryside was no longer safe. A wall around the eternal city was not a symbol of confidence. It was a confession of fear. Aurelian was murdered in 275 CE before he could consolidate his achievements, and the cycle of instability resumed. The economic evidence from the provinces during this period is unambiguous and devastating. Egyptian papyri document the wholesale abandonment of agricultural land, the flight of villagers from their homes, the collapse of markets, the breakdown of the irrigation systems that required collective maintenance to function, and the transformation of tax collection from an administrative process into what can only be described as a military occupation of civilian communities. Tax collectors backed by soldiers arrived in villages, demanded payment in a currency that had lost most of its value, and when payment was not forthcoming, which was frequently because the currency's collapse had disrupted all normal market transactions, they took whatever they could carry: grain from storage pits, animals from buyers, tools from workshops, clothing from bodies. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, described scenes of tax assessment that read like descriptions of military pillage, officials measuring fields step by step, counting vines and fruit trees, recording livestock and poultry, enrolling the names of every person in the household, including children and the elderly, as taxable resources. This was not exaggeration for rhetorical effect. This was the late Roman tax system in practice. Yet, the most devastating legacy of the 3rd century crisis was not the physical destruction of farms and cities. Severe as that was, the most devastating legacy was psychological and institutional, the complete destruction of the relationship of trust and mutual obligation between the Roman state and its agricultural population, replaced by a relationship of naked coercion on the state's side and resentful, fearful compliance on the farmer's side, punctuated increasingly by the most rational economic response available. Flight, this instability continued until, in November 284 CE, an Illyrian soldier of low birth and high intelligence, named Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, seized power with the stated intention of fixing everything, and in doing so, created a fiscal machine so efficient, so comprehensive, and so crushing that it achieved what 3 generations of barbarian invasions and civil war had not quite managed to accomplish: the systematic destruction of the Roman agricultural economy from within. Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus grew up in the Dalmatian province of modern Croatia, in a coastal landscape of gray stone and sharp blue sea, the son of either a freed slave or a low-ranking scribe. The ancient sources disagree, as they disagree about many details of men who rose from obscurity to prominence before anyone thought to document their early years. What is clear is that he rose through military ranks entirely on the basis of his own intelligence, administrative competence, and survival instinct, in an environment where that last quality was tested daily. He was not charismatic in the manner of Caesar or Augustus. He was not philosophically sophisticated in the manner of Marcus Aurelius. He was supremely practical, capable of identifying problems with clinical precision, and possessed of the organizational genius required to attempt solutions at an empire-wide scale. He also had a ruthless streak that made itself apparent in the great persecution of Christians that he launched in 303 CE. The most extensive and systematic attempt to destroy Christianity before it finally destroyed Roman paganism. Instead, he was, in short, a man whose considerable virtues and considerable vices were all expressions of the same underlying quality: the absolute conviction that any problem, however vast and complex, could be solved by sufficiently rigorous, systematic management. The problem he inherited in 284 CE was not simply fiscal. It was civilizational. The Roman Empire was functionally bankrupt in every dimension simultaneously. The currency, the denarius, had been debased from roughly 95% silver content in the 1st century CE to less than 5% by the 260s and 270s, a debasement so thorough that it constituted a de facto default on every financial obligation denominated in denarii. Price inflation had responded accordingly. A modius of wheat that cost 16 denarii in the Principate period cost 120,000 denarii by the 340s CE, according to Egyptian price data. A price increase of roughly 10,000% in 2 centuries. Soldiers refused payment in coin, demanding payment in kind: food, clothing, equipment. Because even soldiers understood the difference between money that could buy things and money that was legally required to be accepted, but practically worthless. Tax collection had degenerated into a chaotic combination of official assessment, local negotiation, bureaucratic corruption, and outright extortion. The army had grown to unprecedented size. Diocletian would eventually command somewhere between 435,000 and 600,000 men, roughly double the Augustan military. And it needed to be paid, fed, clothed, armed, and supplied every single day regardless of whether the treasury was full or empty. Diocletian's response was the most ambitious administrative reform in Roman history, and understanding it in detail is essential to understanding why it destroyed the empire it was designed to save. The centerpiece of his fiscal revolution was the capitatio-iugatio system, which combined two forms of tax assessment into a single, comprehensive, empire-wide mechanism. The iugatio component assessed the productive value of agricultural land, differentiating with considerable sophistication between different types. Irrigated arable land in Syria counted as 1 iugerum per iuga of assessment. Dry farmed grain land in Syro-Palestine required 5 iugera per iuga. Vineyards in the same region required between 3 and 5 iugera per iuga, depending on quality. Olive groves required 13 or more iugera per iuga, depending on tree age and density. The capitatio component assessed human productive capacity. Each adult agricultural worker, male or female, free or enslaved, counted as one caput, one head of taxable labor. The combined assessment expressed each agricultural unit's total tax obligation in a single number, convertible into specific quantities of physical goods through annually published conversion rates. This combined assessment was implemented through the most comprehensive census in Roman history, completed by approximately 287 CE. Every piece of cultivated land in the empire was measured, classified, and assigned a tax value. Every adult agricultural worker was enumerated. The census registers, tabulae censium, created a detailed map of the empire's agricultural productive capacity that survives in fragments in Egyptian papyri and Syrian inscriptions, and that modern historians can use to reconstruct the empire's agricultural geography with remarkable precision. The physical demands of this census, conducted by imperial officials moving district by district through every province, required an expanded bureaucracy that Diocletian provided by doubling the number of provinces from roughly 50 to approximately 100, creating a new layer of administrative grouping called dioceses above the provincial level, and expanding the central and provincial administrative establishments to match. He also doubled or trebled the size of the imperial court, creating a more elaborate ceremonial protocol based on Persian and Hellenistic royal models, in which the emperor was a sacred figure approached through elaborate ritual. shielded by layers of court officials from the direct contact with petitioners that early emperors had maintained. The revenue demand generated by this system was expressed in the annona, the annual levy, a specific quantity of agricultural produce that each province was required to deliver to specified collection points for redistribution to the army and the bureaucracy. This bypassed the broken monetary system entirely, operating as a direct in-kind tax on agricultural production that cut out the inflationary middle step of converting goods to worthless coin and back. In pure administrative logic, it was elegant. In practice, it was catastrophic. Why catastrophic? Because the assessment was based on productive capacity as measured at a specific moment, the census, and was then fixed for a period, typically 5 or 15 years, regardless of what actually happened to agricultural production in the intervening time. A vineyard devastated by a late frost still owed the same number of iuga of assessment as a vineyard with a full harvest. A district depopulated by plague still owed the annona calculated on its pre-plague population. A farm whose ox died and whose sole surviving worker was sick with fever still owed the same caput assessment as a fully staffed farm in a good year. There was no mechanism for assessing actual productivity in any given year, only the fixed census value. This meant that in every bad year, and there were many bad years, because the Mediterranean agricultural system was and is subject to substantial year-to-year variability. The tax demand exceeded the actual surplus production and ate into the seed grain, the breeding stock, and the working capital that farmers needed to produce next year's harvest. Each year that production fell short of the assessment was a year that left farmers slightly worse off than they had been. Over enough years, the deterioration became irreversible. Diocletian also made a good faith attempt to address monetary instability through the Edict on Maximum Prices, issued in 301 CE, which set legally enforceable ceiling prices for hundreds of goods and services, from wheat and wine to haircuts and teachers' fees. The preamble to this edict reads like a transcript of genuine outrage. The emperor described merchants who charged soldiers 8 times the fair price for goods, who conspired to withhold supplies to drive up prices, who treated the suffering of the population as a personal enrichment opportunity. The price controls failed, predictably. Merchants who could not sell at official prices simply did not sell. Goods disappeared from markets. Barter replaced commerce in many areas, and the edict was gradually abandoned without formal repeal over the following years. But the edict's survival in multiple copies across the empire, fragments found in Greece, Egypt, Turkey, and Bulgaria, demonstrates both the ambition of the reform and the desperation that motivated it. Yet the very comprehensiveness of Diocletian's fiscal system was precisely what made it so devastating, because an empire-wide tax demand expressed in physical quantities of agricultural produce assessed on specific parcels of land, regardless of actual productivity in any given year, enforced by an expanded military bureaucracy with strong institutional incentives to meet targets rather than maintain long-term agricultural viability. This was not merely an aggressive tax system, it was a mechanism for systematically liquidating the agricultural capital of the Roman world, eating the empire's seed corn, and calling it fiscal policy. Then, from the farms and villages of Egypt and North Africa and Asia Minor and Gaul, evidence began accumulating in government registers, in petitions to governors, in abandoned census rolls, and empty village sites. Evidence that the Roman farmer, confronted with a tax demand he could not meet without destroying his capacity to farm next year, was making the only rational economic choice available to him. To understand what Diocletian's tax system actually meant for the ordinary Roman farmer, the man or woman who woke before dawn to work fields their family had cultivated for generations, we need to move away from imperial administrative theory and into the gritty, terrifying reality of provincial taxation in the late Roman Empire. The papyri of Roman Egypt provide our most detailed evidence, preserved by the extraordinary dryness of the Egyptian climate in quantities that would astonish even the most assiduous Roman archivist. They show a world of relentless fiscal pressure in which even small farmers maintained meticulous written records of their tax payments, their arrears, their negotiations with collectors, their appeals to superior officials, and their increasingly desperate attempts to manage obligations that exceeded their means. A petition from villagers in the Hermopolite Nome, dated to around 320 CE, describes the situation with heartbreaking directness. The village has been assessed at a certain number of iuga, but half the village's farmland is currently flooded. The harvest has been poor for 3 successive years, and several families have already fled, leaving their neighbors responsible for the departed family's tax obligations through the mechanism of epibole. The remaining villagers request relief. There is no record of what response they received, but the pattern of subsequent petitions from the same district suggests the answer was no. The edict on maximum prices provides additional evidence about the economic reality of Diocletian's reform period. When the edict was issued in 301 CE, it set maximum prices for agricultural produce that, when compared to the tax demands expressed in annona schedules from the same period, suggest that farmers in most provinces were required to hand over between 40 and 60% of their gross agricultural production in taxes and related charges. The annona itself, the supplementum that covered transportation costs, the capitatio assessment, and various local charges, collectively described in late Roman sources as the sordid immunera, the squalid obligations, 40 to 60% of gross production, sounds like a manageable tax rate until you remember that ancient Mediterranean agriculture operated on net margins. After seed, after fodder for draft animals, after minimum household consumption, that typically left perhaps 20 to 30% of gross production as genuinely disposable surplus. A tax rate of 40 to 60% of gross did not leave farmers with a reduced surplus. It left them with nothing, or less than nothing. The response was not passive resignation. The Roman farmer of the late 3rd and 4th centuries was not helpless before the fiscal machine. He was, in fact, a remarkably resourceful economic actor who deployed every available strategy to survive. He concealed productive capacity from census takers, understating the area and quality of his land and the number of workers on his estate. He negotiated with local officials, offering informal payments in exchange for reduced assessments, a practice so widespread that Diocletian's administrative reforms included specific provisions against it, provisions that were almost universally ignored because the local officials themselves depended on those informal arrangements to supplement their official salaries. He defaulted on tax payments and accumulated arrears in the hope that periodic amnesties, which emperors occasionally issued as gestures of imperial generosity, would clear his debts before collection became enforcement. And when all else failed, he fled. He abandoned his assessed plot and walked away into the anonymity of a city, a different province, or simply the vast agricultural hinterland where the reach of official administration was weakest. The technical term for this flight was anachoresis in Greek, the language of Egyptian papyri, literally, withdrawal. And it was so common in the late Roman period that the administrative response to it, epibole, the forced redistribution of fled farmers' tax obligations to their neighbors, became one of the defining fiscal institutions of the late empire. The cultural dimension of this fiscal devastation was expressed most powerfully in a religious revolution that swept the empire in precisely this period. Christianity, a minority sect originating in Roman Palestine in the early 1st century CE, persecuted intermittently by Roman authorities as a threat to public order and traditional religion, and still a minority faith at the beginning of Diocletian's reign, a minority that Diocletian himself attempted to suppress with considerable ferocity in his great persecution of 300 and 311 CE, offered a spiritual vision that spoke directly and powerfully to the experience of late Roman agricultural poverty. The Christian message was not merely about spiritual consolation, though it offered that too. It was about community, mutual aid, and alternative social solidarity in a world where the official community, the Roman civitas, the imperial state, had revealed itself as predatory rather than protective. Christian communities in the cities and in the countryside maintained networks of practical support for their members. Food for the poor, care for the sick, burial for the dead, advocacy for the imprisoned. These were the functions that the Roman state had promised to perform through its elaborate civic institutions: the grain dole, the public physicians, the collegia, and had progressively failed to deliver as its fiscal crisis deepened. The Church stepped into the vacuum when Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, granting Christians freedom of worship and beginning the process of imperial favor that would make Christianity Rome's official religion. By the end of the century, he was not merely making a personal religious choice. He was recognizing the demographic and social reality that the faith of the dispossessed had become the faith of the majority, and that the Church had become the most effective provider of social services in an empire that could no longer provide them itself. Yet even as Christianity offered spiritual consolation, community solidarity, and a religious identity that existed independently of Roman imperial authority, the fiscal machine continued grinding, and the farmers of the late Roman Empire began responding to its demands, not only with prayer and petition, but with systematic flight, abandoning their assessed land, emptying their villages, creating the vast tracts of abandoned farmland that the sources call agri-deserti, which became the most visible and terrifying symptom of the empire's terminal agrarian crisis. It was at this moment of spreading agricultural abandonment that the Roman state made the decision that would seal the fate of millions of ordinary people and would eventually be recognized by historians as one of the most consequential institutional innovations in ancient history: the decision to legally bind the farmer to the land, eliminating the freedom of movement that made flight possible, and transforming the nominally free Roman agricultural tenant into something that modern scholars recognize without qualification as a serf. The institution historians call the colonate, from the Latin colonus, a tenant farmer, was not invented in the late Roman period. Tenant farming had existed in Rome for centuries, with free men farming land they did not own in exchange for a portion of the harvest paid to the landlord, labor services, and sometimes additional cash payments. What changed in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries was not the economic arrangement, but the legal freedom of the tenant to terminate it. A series of imperial edicts, beginning in the late 3rd century and gathering momentum through the 4th century, progressively stripped the coloni of their fundamental right to leave the land they farmed. The critical moment came with a law of Constantine I, dated to 332 CE, and preserved in the Theodosian Code, that declared in explicit terms any colonist found on someone else's estate must be returned to his original landlord in chains, and the person who harbored him must pay the taxes owed for the period of his absence. This was, by any objective definition, serfdom, the legal binding of a nominally free person to a specific piece of land, transferable with the land when it changed ownership, heritable by his children without their consent, enforceable by chains and by legal compulsion. The distinction between the colonus adscriptitious, the registered serf tenant, and the slave was becoming increasingly theoretical. Both were tied to the land. Both worked under legal compulsion. Both passed their condition to their children. Both had their productive capacity converted into tax assessments in which they had no voice. The free Roman farmer, the man whose ancestor had voted in the tribal assemblies, served with distinction in the legions and embodied the civic virtue that Cincinnatus symbolized and Virgil celebrated, had been converted by imperial decree into a hereditary agricultural serf, and the Roman Empire had created the foundational institution of medieval European feudalism 3 centuries before the Western Empire officially ended. Why did this happen? The logic was entirely fiscal. The great landowners who employed coloni were legally responsible for the tax obligations of the estates they owned, and those tax obligations were calculated on a census-based assessment that included the labor of the workers living on the estate. If those workers left, the tax obligation remained with the land. But without workers to farm the land, neither the landlord nor the state received anything. Binding workers to the land protected the tax base of the estate. From the state's perspective, the colonate created a permanent, enforceable link between taxable labor and taxable land. From the landlord's perspective, it eliminated the risk of labor shortage caused by workers exercising their right to leave. From the worker's perspective, it eliminated the only leverage he possessed in negotiating the terms of his tenancy, the credible threat of departure. The colonate was, in the most fundamental sense, the state solving its fiscal problem by abolishing the economic freedom of its most vulnerable citizens. The religious and philosophical achievement of this era of agricultural enslavement represents one of history's great spiritual ironies. Precisely as Rome reduced its farmers to quasi-servitude, the Christian Church developed the most sophisticated theology of human dignity and spiritual equality the ancient world had produced. Aurelius Augustinus Hipponensis, Augustine of Hippo, born in 354 CE in Thagaste, in Roman North Africa, to a pagan father and a Christian mother named Monica, who would become one of the most celebrated saints in church history, wrote The City of God between 413 and 426 CE in direct response to the Visigothic sack of Rome in 410 CE. This massive work of theological and historical reflection, comprising 22 books, argued that Rome's fall was not the consequence of abandoning the old gods for Christianity, as pagan critics claimed, but the inevitable consequence of Rome's own moral corruption, its greed, its exploitation of the weak, its idolatrous worship of earthly power, its subordination of justice to imperial interest. Augustine's critique of Roman fiscal exploitation was not incidental to his theology. It was central to it. He wrote about Roman taxation with a specificity and bitterness that suggests personal acquaintance with its consequences. The assessors who measured fields and trees and people as if they were commodities to be inventoried. The tax collectors who arrived backed by soldiers and left with everything portable. The courts that enforced collection, even when it meant the destruction of families who had nowhere left to turn. The city of God is, among other things, a sustained argument that a state that treats its agricultural population as a revenue mechanism, rather than as citizens deserving of protection, has forfeited its claim to legitimacy, and that the fall of such a state is not a catastrophe, but a justice. Yet even Augustine's magnificent theological indictment could not arrest the physical reality unfolding across the empire's agricultural heartlands, the continued desertion of farmland, the progressive emptying of villages, the shrinkage of the cultivated area, the decline in the agricultural surpluses that had fed 60 million people. And without those surpluses and the people who produced them, no empire, however sophisticated its theology or impressive its remaining architecture, could continue to function. Then, from the north and east, the forces that would administer the final institutional blow to Rome's fiscal pretensions arrived, not as abstract barbarian hordes of Hollywood imagination, but as specific peoples with specific leaders, entering a Roman world that had already substantially destroyed itself from within. The agri deserti, literally the deserted fields, were by the early 5th century a landscape feature visible across enormous swaths of the Western Empire, most dramatically in North Africa, in southern Italy, in the interior of Gaul, and in much of Britain beyond the major urban centers. Ancient sources and modern archaeological surveys agree. The cultivated area of the Western Roman world in 400 CE was substantially smaller than it had been in 100 CE, even accounting for the population losses of the Antonine and Cyprianic plagues. The land had not become agriculturally unusable. It was simply not being farmed, because the population that had farmed it had dispersed, died, or been absorbed into the great private estates of the surviving aristocracy. The villa landscape of the late empire tells the same story in physical form. The number of villa sites identifiable archaeologically in Italy, Gaul, and Britain peaks in the late 2nd century and declines sharply from the late 3rd century onward. Smaller farms, the kind of independent smallholding that had been the basis of the Roman military system, essentially vanish from the archaeological record by the 4th century in many regions of Italy. What remains are either the great aristocratic villas, increasingly fortified, increasingly self-sufficient, increasingly resembling the proto-feudal entities they were in the process of becoming, or nothing. The military consequences of the agricultural crisis were equally direct. The Roman army of the 5th century, the force that was supposed to defend the empire against the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns, the Burgundians, and the Saxons, was an institution in structural crisis, not because its soldiers were individually less capable than their predecessors, but because the fiscal base that supported it had been progressively destroyed. The Western imperial government of the early 5th century could not pay, feed, arm, or supply its legions at the level of efficiency that frontier defense required. Because the tax base that would have funded those operations had been hollowed out by 2 centuries of fiscal extraction, agricultural abandonment, and demographic decline, the response, paying Germanic foederati with land grants rather than wages, relying increasingly on barbarian warlords to provide military manpower under their own command, was not a strategic choice, but a fiscal necessity. You pay your soldiers with what you have. By the 5th century, what the Western imperial government had was land. Specifically, the abandoned agri deserti that were no longer generating tax revenue. And it used this land to purchase military service from the only people willing and able to provide it. The resulting army was effective at many tasks, but was structurally incapable of maintaining the kind of coordinated strategic defense that the Rhine and Danube frontiers required. The Visigothic entry into the empire in 376 CE, the subsequent war that ended at the catastrophic Roman defeat at Adrianople in 378 CE, the sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 CE, the Vandal conquest of North Africa in the 430s, the devastation of Gaul, and Italy by Attila's Huns in the 440s and 450s. These were not the causes of the Western Empire's fall. They were the consequences of a fiscal collapse that had been building for over a century. In this final twilight of Western Roman power, cultural achievement did not simply cease, it transformed. As Roman intellectual and artistic traditions were absorbed into and reshaped by the Christian Church that was simultaneously inheriting the Roman state's institutional functions, the great basilica architecture of the 5th century, the magnificent early Christian churches of Rome, Ravenna, and Milan, translated the public civic spaces of the Roman Forum and Basilica into sacred space, preserving in their proportions and their decorative programs the aesthetic vocabulary of imperial Rome, while directing it toward entirely different symbolic ends. The mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna, built around 430 CE, and surviving today in almost miraculous completeness, contains mosaics of such transcendent beauty. The deep lapis lazuli of the star-studded vaulting, the gold of the Latin cross, the serene figures of saints and apostles, that standing inside it today produces an effect that is genuinely difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. It is a room that feels like another kind of time altogether. The great Pope Leo the Great, who governed the Roman Church from 440 to 461 CE, conducted diplomacy with Attila the Hun in 452 CE with an effectiveness that the Western imperial government of Valentinian III simply could not match, persuading Attila to withdraw from Italy through a combination of theological authority, personal charisma, and practical negotiation that represented the Church functioning as a state when the state had ceased to be able to function as itself. Yet even the Church's extraordinary institutional vitality could not prevent the Western Empire's final administrative dissolution, which came not with a dramatic last stand, but with a bureaucratic formality when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the teenage Emperor Romulus Augustulus in September 476 CE, and sent his imperial regalia to Constantinople with a polite letter explaining that the West no longer required its own emperor. He was not destroying a functioning institution, but performing a final rite over one that had already been dead for decades. This instability continued in the former Western provinces as successor kingdoms competed and consolidated. And the question of how Rome's fiscal and agrarian legacy would shape the civilization that replaced it remained urgently, consequentially unresolved. The story of Diocletian's tax reforms and the abandonment of Roman farmland did not end in 476 CE or in 565 CE, when Justinian's last reconquests exhausted the Eastern Empire's resources, or in any of the subsequent centuries when historians conventionally date the transitions between Roman and post-Roman civilization. It continued, and in the most direct and traceable institutional lineages, it continues today. The colonnade that Diocletian's fiscal crisis created and Constantine's legislation formalized did not disappear when the Western Empire did. It was inherited, largely intact, by every Germanic successor kingdom in Western Europe, transformed by degrees into the feudal serfdom that defined the social and economic lives of the majority of European people from the 6th century to the 19th. The English villeins, who worked the manors of Norman England in 1086 CE, their obligations, their immobility, their heritable condition of dependent agricultural labor recorded in meticulous detail in the Doomsday Book, were, in legal and social structural terms, the direct institutional descendants of Diocletian's colony. The French serfs who burned their lords' chateaux in the Great Fear of 1789 were breaking chains forged in the tax offices of the late Roman Empire when the Russian serfs were emancipated by Alexander II in 1861. 15 centuries after Constantine's law of 332 CE had bound their institutional ancestors to the land. The legal framework being dismantled was traceable in unbroken institutional descent to the fiscal crisis of Diocletian's reign. the question that Diocletian's reforms posed. How do you extract sufficient resources from an agricultural population to fund a complex state apparatus without destroying the agricultural population you are extracting from is not merely ancient history. It is the central unresolved question of political economy, and every civilization that has failed to answer it correctly has paid Rome's price. The great agrarian revolutions of the modern era, all addressed, in their different ideological languages, the same structural problem that Tiberius Gracchus identified in 133 BCE, and that Diocletian's census administrators codified in registers of Iuga and Capita. Who owns the land, who works it, and who has the right to take its products. When Stalin's Soviet state collectivized agriculture between 1929 and 1933, imposing fixed production quotas on collective farms, regardless of actual harvest yields, confiscating grain from villages that failed to meet their targets, even when confiscation meant starvation, responding to the flight of peasants from rural areas to the cities by introducing an internal passport system that legally bound agricultural workers to their collective farms. The structural parallels with late Roman fiscal policy were so precise as to be almost pedagogically useful. The Soviet internal passport of 1932 was Constantine's Law of 332 CE in Stalinist form, a legal instrument designed to prevent the flight of agricultural labor from the land by eliminating the freedom of movement that made flight possible. The Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine of 1932–1933, which killed somewhere between 3.5 and 7.5 million people, was the Soviet equivalent of the agri-deserti, land stripped of its human population by fiscal demands that exceeded biological survival, leaving behind a silence where a civilization had been. The 21st century inherits all of these legacies simultaneously, in forms that are sometimes visible and sometimes not. The legal systems of continental Europe, French civil law, Italian law, German law, Spanish law, the legal traditions of every country that experienced Roman rule or Roman cultural influence, are built on foundations laid in the Justinianic corpus juris civilis, itself a codification of the Roman legal tradition that includes the laws of Diocletian, Constantine, and their successors, creating the colonate, the principle that the state has the right to assess agricultural land, to enumerate agricultural workers, to demand a fixed proportion of agricultural production, regardless of actual yields. This principle, which Diocletian systematized with such terrible thoroughness, and which the subsequent imperial legislation enforced with such catastrophic consequences, is so fundamental to modern assumptions about state fiscal authority that we rarely notice it unless we are scholars of late Roman fiscal history. The great contemporary debates about agricultural taxation, land value taxes, the rights of subsistence farmers in the developing world against the demands of national fiscal systems, the appropriate balance between revenue extraction and agricultural sustainability. These debates replay in modern registers and with modern technologies, arguments that Roman senators, provincial governors, and village headmen argued with exactly the same combination of genuine conviction and naked self-interest that we bring to them today, and somewhere in rural Turkey or Morocco or Greece or Italy or Tunisia, on soil that Roman census takers enumerated in Yuga nearly 2,000 years ago, on land that Virgil described and Columella advised on, and Diocletian's administrators assessed and taxed to destruction. A farmer is calculating the same equation that Roman coloni calculated in the 4th century CE, whether the combined demands of market, state, climate, and debt leave enough margin to justify remaining on the land, whether the covenant between people and earth, the covenant that those pre-Roman Italian tribes understood instinctively, that Virgil tried to articulate in the Georgics, that Diocletian's fiscal machinery converted into an instrument of extraction. Whether that covenant can survive in a world that has never stopped needing what farmers produce, but has never found a stable way to value the lives of those who produce it. The Roman Empire fell, in the end, not because the barbarians were stronger, but because Rome forgot that the empire was not the marble and the legions and the administrative machinery. The empire was the farmer kneeling in the field at dawn, the woman carrying grain to the thrashing floor at dusk, the child learning the names of the plants and the rhythms of the seasons that would define the entire shape of their life. When those people stood up and walked away, and walk away they did, across the width of the Roman world from Britannia to Aegyptus, from the Rhine to the Euphrates, driven by tax demands that no longer left them enough to live on. They took everything that mattered with them, and what remained was a shell, impressive to look at, magnificent to photograph, already hollow at its core. The lesson has been available for 2,000 years, engraved in the abandoned fields and the empty villages and the beautiful silent ruins. We are still, today, in the process of deciding whether to learn it.